welcome to Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, Director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Wednesday, August 7th, 2024. We have a tale of trucking and interstate commerce from the Fifth Circuit, and then we're going to get a tale of Facebook and animal rights and the government's ability to police its own forums from the DC Circuit. First, just a couple of announcements. So, as many of you know, law students who sometimes listen to this podcast, the upcoming school year is on its way, and near the beginning of that school year, we are going to have our annual Supreme Court preview. So that's going to be at the University of North Carolina Law School in September, and so that will be on the pod waves shortly thereafter. So you can wait for that. Another thing coming up, this I'm guessing does not affect many Short Circuit listeners, but if you just so happen to be at the American Political Science Association conference in Philadelphia in early September, I will be on a panel there talking about state constitutions. It'll be on the Saturday, September 7th. So if you happen to be at that conference, feel free to come up, identify yourself as one of the many Short Circuit listeners. It would be great to meet you. However, in the meantime, we have two Short Circuit guests that I'm very happy to introduce to you. So one of them, he'll be doing the first case. Suranjan Sen is coming on once again to grace us with his voice. But before that, we have a first-timer, a IJ attorney who started with us back at the beginning of 2024. It's taken me way too long, but we finally have him on the podcast, and that's Michael Seufert. So, Michael, welcome to Short Circuit.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So Michael is many things. He's, speaking of Philly, he's a Philly native. He went to Harvard Law School. He clerked on the Fifth Circuit for Judge King. And then he was in the trenches of big law for a while and then decided to do something a little bit less busy, but more rewarding. And that's work at the Institute for Justice. So I understand also that you can play the piano, which is not something many Short Circuit guests can do. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started in high school. I just sort of took it up and, got better at it kind of rapidly and dropped it for most of college and law school and kind of picked it back up again as a pandemic hobby.
That sounds familiar. Yeah, I did not pick piano playing up, but certain things changed in my life. Suranjan, did you have a pandemic hobby?
Yeah, I think my pandemic hobby was drinking and binge eating.
Okay,
I did that too.
My pandemic hobby was wearing athletic shorts too often and realizing eventually, wait, I can't fit in my suit anymore.
Yeah, I'm not gonna talk about personal experience with that. But what I will talk with you about is interstate commerce, which was a pandemic hobby of many people who maybe bought a little too much on Amazon from time to time. But this is not about Amazon. This is about trucky trailers or trucks full of crude oil, it seems.
Yeah, so this case is about what counts as, quote, interstate commerce, as defined by the Motor Carriage Act, not necessarily the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. That said, though, I believe that the Constitution's Commerce Clause, and specifically the complete, if I may say, farce the Supreme Court has made of it over the last 80 years, is the elephant in the room, which I'll explain later. This Fifth Circuit case is about whether oil truck haulers who operate entirely within the state of Texas are operating within, quote, interstate commerce for the purpose of the Motor Carriage Act. If they are, then they're exempt from federal overtime pay requirements. If they aren't, then they have to pay up. The court, in this case, has said that they aren't, but based solely on binding precedent, not based on anything resembling a legal analysis. That is, the court is very careful here not to suggest that it agrees with this precedent. And Judge Oldham, in a concurring opinion, suggested the precedent might be wrong. And as I'll explain later, the precedent not only is probably wrong, but I would say necessarily is wrong. So there's these two acts that were passed in the 1930s. The one is the Federal Labor Standards Act, which regulates employers unless you're exempted. This is enforced through the Department of Labor. And around the same time, also in the, I believe, late 30s, you have the Motor Carriage Act, which was enforced through the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is now the Department of Transportation. And it regulates all motor carriers who are engaged in, quote, interstate commerce. And the Motor Carriage Act defines interstate commerce as, quote, commerce between any place in a state and any place in another state, or between places in the same state through another state. To prevent overlap between the two, Congress has exempted employers subject to the MCA from FLSA regulation. And so Congress's rule is basically this. If you're a commercial motor carrier, you're subject to the FLSA unless you're engaged in, quote, commerce between any place in a state and any place in another state, yada, yada, yada. So let's jump to this case. The defendant is an oil truck hauler who operates entirely within the state of Texas. The plaintiff sued, saying that she's owed extra overtime pay pursuant to the FLSA. The defendant truck hauler said, wait a minute, we're exempt. We operate solely within, even though we operate solely within Texas, our oil is destined for locations mostly outside of Texas. The court accepted that position, the defendant's position, saying that it's bound by precedent. And as I said, Judge Oldham had a concurrence saying that this doesn't really seem to fit the text at all. By the way, as an aside, this doesn't really matter in this case, but I just have to mention this. If they were not exempt, the test for whether she'd be owed overtime pay is something like literally an 8-factor test. And I don't know offhand what the factors are. I don't want to know. I hope I never know. But one of my pet peeves is unwieldy factorial tests. And I strongly believe, by and large, there shouldn't be any test that's more than 3 factors. If you've got more than 3 factors, you're being redundant and you can consolidate some. I would bet a good deal of money, whatever this 8-factor test is, it does not need to be 8 factors.
So I haven't looked at the 8 factors either, and I also don't want to look, but I'm guessing it might be a little bit like the whole test for whether someone's an employee or independent contractor, which is always like a super complicated, way more complicated than needs to be thing.
My eyes get glazed over every single time. I have no patience for it. So back to the analogy, I would have ruled that they're exempt just because I don't feel like dealing with this 8-factor test. So back to this analysis here of interstate commerce under the MCA. Judge Oldham is absolutely correct that it does violence to the statutory text to take Congress's statutory definition and have that, meaning commerce must be between state A and state B, and have that include people transporting goods that who are ultimately bound, who knows how long from now, by somebody else to go across the state. But I think this is more than just statutory interpretation. The court doesn't address this at all. But in my opinion, this has to grapple with Commerce Clause jurisprudence. Our federal government, your listeners have probably heard this before to some extent, but our federal government is theoretically supposed to be a government of limited and enumerated powers. Emphasis here on theoretically, because, as I'll explain in a moment, the federal government's authority to pass laws regulating interstate commerce has been expanded to where it's effectively an authority to do literally anything it wants. When the MCA was passed in the late 30s, the leading case for interpreting the Commerce Clause was Schechter Poultry, which you might know in legal circles as the sick chicken case. That case was struck down.
Well, the kosher chicken case also. So is that a couple
really?
kosher
I didn't
butchers?
know that.
There's this like huge story behind it that we'll put a link in the show notes about it. But anyway, very interesting story.
Cool. So that case struck down the President Roosevelt's National Industrial Recovery Act as exceeding Congress's authority under the Commerce Clause because it regulated wholly intrastate commercial activities. The court said in that case, to reach Congress's authority, you must be directly involved in a stream of interstate commerce. And I believe this was a unanimous opinion that even like Brandeis joined onto.
Well, unanimous judgment at least, yeah.
Right. What I mean to say is I believe the court unanimously held that it was beyond their Commerce Clause, also beyond their non-delegation principle, but that's another story. There was a lot wrong with the New Deal, it turns out. But by wording the MCA the way it did, in my opinion, Congress very clearly was limiting the MCA's exception to drivers literally crossing state lines because Congress was operating in a paradigm where all of its authority was where the maximum extent, the full extent of it, the outer limits of its authority under the Commerce Clause was people who are engaged in a stream of interstate commerce that, even if you're not in a commercial activity that's interstate, this will eventually go. And so by wording it the way it did, it had to be consciously narrowing it from what its view of what its Commerce Clause authority was. And so by expanding the definition that it has here, the Fifth Circuit is basically saying Congress meant to exempt the whole of motor carriers subject to its Commerce Clause authority. And this presents a problem. For the Fifth Circuit's interpretation to be correct, you have to accept the following proposition. You are not engaged in interstate commerce. Therefore, you are subject to Congress's regulation of interstate commerce. So let me say that again. You are not engaged in interstate commerce, and therefore you are subject to Congress's regulation of interstate commerce. So the retort, of course, is that the courts post-MCA have exploded Congress's Commerce Clause power to include literally anything, which I figure, unless you want me to, I figure your listeners are probably familiar with Wickard and its hellacious progeny. But I think that really what I would love to see, of course, what I think a lot of us would love to see would be a rollback of that jurisprudence. But at the very least, I would think that any statutory interpretation here of exactly what the MCA was supposed to exempt would be like jurisprudential malpractice to not consider that Congress was operating in a Schechter world when they wrote this.
Michael, do you see this in a Schechter world?
I mean, yes, that makes sense to me now. I have to admit, when I first read about this in the Short Circuit newsletter, my reaction was, oh, well, this seems completely consistent with Wickard v. Filburn. Nothing much going on here. The Oldham concurrence is really interesting insofar as how he kind of lays out just how crazy this is and traces it not just from the Motor Carrier Act, but to the 1971 Department of Labor rule, and then the subsequent congressional revisions of the statute. It is crazy more so in how far it departs from a pretty clear statutory text, and then ignores subsequent changes to that text.
That was something interesting I found in the Oldham concurrence, and I haven't really thought too deeply about, but I think there's a lot there, which is Congress. So you have the 1935 enactment and it being in the Schechter world, but then you have Congress tweaking it later where it's very much in the Wickard world, and where interstate commerce constitutionally means, anything you want. But in the later kind of tweaking that Congress does, it seems like Congress and the Department of Labor aren't even talking about the same thing. And so what does this statute actually mean at that point it's almost like a metaphysical question. Do you look at 1935? Do you look at the intentions of Congress in the 70s? Do you look at how courts in the 1970s interpreted statutes, which was, this way out there purpose of is legislative history. Who cares what the text even says at that point? And so then you have all this case law, and then, I can see where Judge Willett's coming from on the bottom line. You have all this case law, you have all this other stuff. What the heck does it mean? I don't know. We're not going to do anything new today because none of this even makes sense.
Yeah, the lineup of opinions here is pretty interesting. These are three extremely well-regarded judges on the Fifth Circuit. Judge Willett is a former Texas Supreme Court justice. Judges Oldham and Higginson, both very well-regarded, both former SCOTUS clerks. And I find the majority opinion really interesting in that it kind of just says, very blandly, we're just applying our prior precedent and the outcome here is straightforward. We're bound by it, but not really criticizing that precedent or suggesting that the court reconsider it. And then Judge Oldham has this solo concurrence laying out just what a mess the precedent is, and how far it departs from not just the original meaning of the statute, but the meaning of the statute as amended
Right.
later. And I find it interesting that for the most part, like none of what is in Judge Oldham's opinion really is previewed in the majority opinion, except for, a few comments here and there about how we're applying precedent. And I wonder if that's just because everyone kind of agrees that under the current text of the statute, this would probably be the outcome in kind of a post-Wickard world.
Yeah, but one problem that I see about taking the text too. So if they just want to say, yeah, it's just like Wickard, and so like Saranjan was saying, that kind of means that everyone driving a truck commercially doesn't get overtime because they're exempt under this Motor Carrier Act. Whereas I think really the reason for having that Motor Carrier Act be an exemption from the overtime rules that like every run-of-the-mill American worker gets is someone driving across country for massive numbers of hours. It's gonna make things very financially difficult for a lot of trucking companies, and shipping rates are going to go through the roof if those guys get paid overtime or these women get paid overtime, like the plaintiff here. But if it's just truckers driving within a city, so say a moving company, an intra-city moving company, or just taking the bread from the bakery to the local supermarket, then we're more okay with giving those people overtime, right? So I'm guessing that's really the congressional kind of matrix here. And they've just used this off-the-shelf interstate commerce, which to normal people means you actually go across country instead of the Wickard test. And so if you upend that, then you're really going to change, all the deliberations that are behind all this. Saranjan, do you think I'm right there, or is there some greater mystery?
I mean, I think you might be right substantively, and like formally, it's. I think that it seems like what they just wanted to do is they just wanted to have a. So if you look at, the FLSA is administered by the Department of Labor, whereas the Motor Carriage Act is administered by now the Department of Transportation. And so it might even be, from Congress's perspective, less even, we want this to be this way and we want that to be that way. It might be more, we want the rules for, labor can be in charge of just pay type issues, employer-employee issues generally, but we think that this industry should be regulated by DOT, and if DOT wants them to be to have these various overtime pay requirements, then DOT can do it. But let's leave that to the experts on this specific industry. I'm not sure to what extent Congress was really thinking about what substantively this would look like either way, but more just who's in charge.
Yeah, could be Congress wasn't thinking at all, which has happened before. So another area of law where it seems like maybe people weren't thinking all that hard is where government agencies set up Facebook and Instagram accounts and let people comment on them. I got to say, if I was running a government agency, I would not have that agency have a Facebook account after reading this case. But maybe that's exactly the kind of incentive that is running the wrong way. And we're going to have a discussion about kind of how that works. So that's a convoluted way to introduce this very interesting case Michael's going to talk about from the DC Circuit, which has to do with a government agency Facebook account and some very active commenters.
Yeah, it is a very interesting case. The plaintiffs here are PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and two animal rights advocates. The defendant is the head of the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, which funds a bunch of health and science-related research. And they decided to use their Facebook and Instagram pages to post about about the research that they funded, I guess show the public what all of our taxpayer dollars are going to. And they had certain comment guidelines for comments on their Facebook posts and their Instagram posts. And they operationalized those by using keyword filters, which on Facebook and Instagram allow you to sort of automatically hide comments that contain certain words. Just because the volume of comments that they get is way too big for any NIH employee or group of NIH employees to go through in real time and filter out the ones that are off topic. And so in this case, the kind of relevant keywords that they used, among others, were PETA, PETA Latino, animals, torture, and the names of some researchers who'd experimented on monkeys.
And also Hitler and Nazi, I see.
Yes, Hitler and Nazi.
Don't have that come up.
Yes, I think hashtag Believe Mothers was another one. And I'll honestly admit, maybe I'm not online enough, but I have no idea what that refers to or why the NIH decided to filter it out. But it's neither here nor there for purposes of this case. So after PETA sued, obviously a government lawyer spotted the problem with some of these keywords. And so they removed a few that very clearly were intended to target PETA and the views of people who were against, experimenting on animals, because that would be viewpoint discrimination, which we'll get into a little bit later. So there are two issues for the court here. The first is whether whether the NIH's Facebook and Instagram pages are a public forum. That's important because it changes the standard of review the court will use, essentially like how closely it's going to scrutinize the government's actions and what sort of justification it's going to require the government to put forward. And then the second issue is kind of the main event, which is, do the filters actually violate the First Amendment under whatever standard they choose at the first step? So the first question, is it a public forum? The court kind of goes through this whole taxonomy of forums and non-public forums. So there's the public forum, which itself is subdivided into a traditional public forum. Think, kind of the town square, a place where there's a long history of people being able to say whatever it is they want. And then there's a designated public forum. So this could be something like, a city council or school board meeting where it's open for comment in, the last 30 minutes, and there are no restrictions on the comments people have made. So there isn't a long history of the public necessarily being able to speak their mind there, but the government entity has made the affirmative decision to open it up to public comment. And so these kind of carry with them the most stringent restrictions on government regulation of speech. Then there's this category of non-public forums. These are places like government offices. You can't jump up on the Attorney General's desk and yell out whatever it is you want. The government restrictions here, they just have to be reasonable, and they can't suppress speech solely because the government disagrees with it. So the government can't say you can jump up on the Attorney General's desk and protest against abortion, but you can't jump up on the Attorney General's desk and protest in favor of a woman's right to choose. Then there's this kind of hybrid category of limited public forums. Key example here is, say, the same example I gave for designated public forums of a city council meeting or a school board meeting where the last 30 minutes is open to comment, but the government body says any comments have to relate to the purpose of the meeting. So it's a public forum, but the government has put limitations on it. So it kind of falls into this hybrid category. And essentially the same standard applies as for non-public forums.
Right. So I can't just go into that forum and talk about how much I hate the Yankees. because that has nothing to do with the city council's business or whatever.
Right. If the city council put no restrictions whatsoever on what people could say, and people, come up and talk about the Yankees, then that would be a designated public forum. But if they say, it has to be germane, then that's a limited public forum. Right. So the question here really then is, did the NIH affirmatively open up the comments on its social media pages? And of course it did, because you can shut down the comment section on your Facebook and Instagram pages and have 0 comments. The NIH decided not to do that. They wanted the public to engage. They wanted people to make comments. And so they created a public forum. And then the question is really just whether it's a limited public forum or a designated public forum. It seems pretty obvious that it's a limited public forum because the NIH does have standards for what can go in the comments. We're really, only talking about the off-topic restrictions here, but there are all sorts of other restrictions. The NIH won't allow profanity. They won't allow, comments on a number of other subjects. They won't allow comments that are abusive or harassing. So PETA's only counter argument here is that this was actually a designated public forum because the NIH didn't enforce its rules perfectly. It didn't exclude 100% of off-topic comments. It allowed some through. And it analogizes to these cases where the government just, it announces restrictions on speech for a forum, but it just doesn't bother to enforce them.
Like certain public universities in the last school year, some kind of comes to mind.
Yeah, the court distinguishes those cases really based on the nature of online social media. The NIH just doesn't have the capacity to screen every comment, and its automatic filters are really a best effort to enforce its guidelines. So that shows that it really did intend to force the guidelines, and it really did intend to create a limited public forum as opposed to a designated public forum. And that's what matters here. The fact that some off-topic comments made it through wasn't really enough to create an inference that, the NIH just opened this up to whatever. Then kind of as an afterthought, the court mentions that whether the forum is compatible with expressive activity factors into the analysis. And the court says, social media is inherently compatible with expressive activity. It's probably one of the most important places for that in our society. But the court just kind of hand waves that and says, it doesn't really matter here because, the NIH didn't affirmatively create a designated public forum. So we're just going to move on. This does come up a bit later in the opinion where they discuss the reasonableness standard. So we'll kind of come back to that. So now this is a limited public forum. That just means that the NIH can't discriminate based on viewpoint. And its restrictions have to be reasonable. And the kind of the difference what viewpoint discrimination is the kind of example I gave earlier. There are content-based restrictions, so you can't talk about Israel, for instance. And then there are viewpoint-based descriptions, which target a specific viewpoint about that subject. So you can't make comments in support of Israel, or you can't make comments that are critical of Israel. That would be viewpoint discrimination. So the court here kind of first, pretty blandly notes that the NIH's purpose is to communicate with the public and encourage respectful and constructive dialogue, which I don't know how anyone nowadays can come to social media with that purpose, knowing what we know, but nevertheless.
God bless them.
And here's where the court says that because social media is so inherently expressive, unlike, say, a public football stadium, the reasonableness standard has more bite. And so they're going to apply it a bit more strictly because of the nature of this forum. So they say in the abstract, NIH's restrictions serve a permissible objective. It's reasonable to want to keep comment threads on topic. And because this is a limited public forum, there's no requirement of narrow tailoring or, the least restrictive means like there would be with potentially with a designated public forum or traditional public forum. All the NIH has to do is draw a sensible line between what can come in and what has to stay out. And the court says it hasn't done that because it often posts about research conducted on animals or about researchers who experiment on animals. So comments about experiments on animals are germane to those, obviously. The government tries to say that a reasonable policy can be both under and over-inclusive, and the court agrees with that in the abstract, but it says this policy isn't reasonable because, quote, a substantial portion of NIH posts are related to animal research. The court kind of pressed the government on, give us a definition of off-topic that would be workable in practice. And the government just couldn't give them an example of that. The court says, what about a study by a researcher who tests on animals? What's the topic of that post? Is it the study? Is it the researcher? Are comments about the researcher necessarily off topic? The government just can't provide any workable standard here. And the court also kind of notes, and here's what I think is the elephant in the room. After this litigation began, the NIH removed filters for PETA and hashtag stop animal testing because it realized those were viewpoint discrimination. The court kind of elides whether there's viewpoint discrimination here, but it just says that, the fact that there were these potentially viewpoint discriminatory keywords just highlights the fact that NIH didn't provide its social media managers with a workable standard. So the standard isn't reasonable. And then the court says, because there's no way to, the NIH doesn't have a Facebook comment board of appeals. There's no way to have an actual person at the NIH, look at your comment and decide whether it's, furthering public dialogue and is on topic if it's filtered out by the keyword filters. It's just lost forever. And then kind of at the very end, the court returns to the viewpoint discrimination again, but it doesn't really say how that factors into the analysis. I do think that's just kind of, again, the elephant in the room and is part of why the court thinks these are unreasonable, even though it's not that tough a standard for the government to meet, because the NIH here was very clearly trying to target PETA and was, excluding PETA's potential, in many cases on topic comments about animal research. They just didn't like their viewpoint. And under the First Amendment, the government can't silence you just because it doesn't like what you have to say.
Suranjan, have you ever commented on an agency Facebook page? Is that something you do?
If I did, I'd be faced with the choice of either having to lie or having to make a comment that would ensure that federal agents show up at my door. So no, I have not.
Probably a bad habit.
Well, first I have to say that whenever I read these First Amendment cases, it's a little hard for me not to resent seeing that judges, in fact, can be engaged when they want to be. I would love for, quote, reasonable restrictions on property to be akin to this analysis of reasonable restrictions on speech. I'd love to see restrictions on occupational freedom be knocked down for being over or under inclusive, but I digress. With all that said, I can live with this decision on both points. Point one, government surely can hide or delete off-topic comments on its social media. The notion that it can't or effectively can't, and that people, every single time the government posts anything, is going to be flooded with trolls, it would be pretty absurd. But point two, there needs to be meaningful judicial oversight over the extent to which government can deem a comment off-topic, and categorical bans on any comment that uses words like, quote, animal, that aren't obscene. You shouldn't cut it. And I think this is actually quite important because a lot of the danger to our communicative public channels comes from what I would consider a form of propaganda, to include when government or other entities give the false impression that there is a popular or expert consensus on a given issue or support for a given issue when there isn't or isn't anywhere close to it. And one tool that these institutions can use to give a false impression like that is to delete or hide any public comments that are critical of what's being said, and to only allow or to boost all of the positive comments. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what the NIH goal in this specific instances, but it's something that I think the courts need to be aware of, and it's something that the courts even could effectively, whether or not that is the intention of the agency, to say, aha, we're going to mislead the public. When you're engaged in content moderation that isn't sufficiently tailored to precisely the evil to be attended, then that's, there's a real danger of that. And I mean, is the Republic going to fall because some PETA comments were hidden to some NIH Facebook posts? Probably not. But nevertheless, I think that the court putting in a line in the sand of saying, like, look, maybe if this means, in fact, that it's going to be too unwieldy and you're not going to be able to really do this at all, and you're going to have to just disable all comments from all of your posts, then so be it. That's better than the specter of having government give people false impressions of what comments are, or denying people information of useful public comments and on-topic public comments that are being suppressed, whether intentionally or otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, you do have to hand it to whoever set up these pages that it's really kind of a noble thing that they open it up to public comment, because they easily could not have comments, could under the government speech doctrine spend public money on advertising how awesome they are, with no ability for the public to comment in this kind of atmosphere, and yet they open it up. But if they're going to open it up, you can't just allow them to pick and choose, whoever, or it does turn into just propaganda. So I see, I don't envy the position of whoever is running these pages, whether it's for a government agency at the federal level or a small city or whatever it is. There's some tricky issues they have to deal with. One thing I thought is interesting, although upon reflection, I guess I understand why, is there's, other than a very brief citation, there's nothing here about the Supreme Court's recent cases about personal Facebook pages and or Twitter pages or whatever. And so some listeners know about the Supreme Court address this year of, people who say are on a city council, but they have a personal account. And so how do you tell if it's like, can they block people who post on those if it's just a personal account and yet they're talking about city business on their own account? Well, none of that really applies here, because everyone admits this is the NIH with its own Facebook account. There's nothing. This is like government speech, pure and simple. And so the First Amendment absolutely is going to apply here. But just because you get over that roadblock doesn't mean that it's easy to sort it all out at that point.
Yeah, I feel like what's driving a lot of the court's analysis here is the fact that this is really viewpoint discrimination, even though the court doesn't want to come out and say it. Clearly a government lawyer, the second DOJ got involved in this, recognized that the court kind of keeps returning to the fact that the NIH is trying to suppress PETA's viewpoints. And so, there's a way in which this opinion is maybe not that aggressive, because it doesn't go outright. It doesn't outright call this viewpoint discrimination, but just says, it's unreasonable because maybe some of these would be on topic. And so it's not really applying the government's stated policy and stated goal in a reasonable way.
Yeah, it's there are no bright lines, it seems, in this area. But one thing that anyone should know about the First Amendment is you can't have viewpoint discrimination. And so hopefully they're properly schooled in that now, and going forward, things might be a little clearer. Well, thank you both for coming on and giving your viewpoints today, Michael and Suranjan. And Michael, we will definitely be having you on more down the road, and Suranjan coming back as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. And in the meantime, I hope that all of you get engaged.